My wife texted, "Staying late with my boss again. Don't wait." I wrote back, "All good. I'll keep his wife busy." 20 minutes later, she came flying barefoot, pale and shaking like she'd seen a ghost. Let me back up and give you the full picture. My name is David Mitchell, and I'm a radiology technician at Mercy General Hospital here in Millbrook, Ohio. It's one of those mid-sized Midwest towns where everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least thinks they do. I've been reading X-rays, MRIs, and CT scans for the past 15 years, ever since I got out of the Navy and used my GI Bill to get trained in medical imaging. 23 years of marriage to Sarah, one daughter Emma, who's a junior at Ohio State studying pre-law, and a mortgage on a colonial house in the Maple Heights subdivision that keeps me working overtime whenever I can get it. The thing about being a radiology tech is that you develop an eye for patterns. You learn to spot the subtle shadows that might indicate a tumor, the slight misalignment that suggests a fracture, the telltale signs that something isn't quite right, even when everything appears normal on the surface. After 15 years of staring at images and finding what others miss, those pattern recognition skills become second nature. You start applying them to everything, including your personal life. Sarah works in the hospital's administrative offices, specifically in the surgical scheduling department. She's always been ambitious, the kind of person who has 5-year plans and color-coded calendars and networking events circled in red ink. When we first met at a hospital Christmas party back in 2001, I was drawn to her drive and intelligence. She had goals, plans, a vision for the future that included climbing the corporate ladder and building something meaningful together. Lately, though, she'd become distant. Not in any dramatic way, no sudden personality changes or obvious red flags. Just a gradual cooling, like a thermostat being turned down 1 degree at a time, until you suddenly realize you're sitting in a cold room wondering when the warmth disappeared. The late nights had started about 4 months ago. Always the same pattern. A text around 6 p.m. saying she'd be working late with Dr. Richard Brennan, the chief of surgery. Dr. Brennan was one of those larger-than-life personalities that hospitals seem to attract. Brilliant surgeon, commanding presence, the kind of man who dominated every room he entered. He'd been at Mercy General for 8 years, building the cardiac surgery program from nothing into one of the most respected in the state. At first, the late nights made sense. Sarah had been promoted to senior administrative coordinator 6 months earlier, and working closely with department heads was part of her new responsibilities. Dr. Brennan was demanding, perfectionist, the type who expected his staff to match his own obsessive attention to detail. If he wanted to stay late reviewing surgical schedules and quarterly reports, it made sense that Sarah would need to be there too. But my radiology tech instincts were starting to pick up inconsistencies. This was the 4th late night this month, and when I looked at the pattern objectively, it felt too systematic, too convenient. The timing was always the same, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, occasionally a Saturday afternoon. The excuses were always identical: reviewing schedules, preparing reports, catching up on administrative backlog. Most telling of all, Sarah's behavior on these late nights didn't match someone who'd been grinding through paperwork for 4 hours. She'd come home energized, almost giddy, with a brightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. When someone spends an evening doing tedious administrative work, they come home tired and complaining. Sarah came home looking like she'd been somewhere exciting. I was sitting in our kitchen that Tuesday evening, eating leftover pizza and reviewing patient files on my laptop, when her text came through. "Staying late with my boss again. Don't wait." The message was identical to the ones from previous weeks, down to the punctuation and phrasing. In radiology, when you see the exact same pattern repeating without variation, it usually means something artificial is creating that pattern. That's when I sent my reply, "All good. I'll keep his wife busy." It wasn't a random response. I'd been thinking about Margaret Brennan for weeks, ever since the hospital Christmas party, where she'd approached me with unusually pointed questions about Sarah's work schedule. At the time, I'd assumed she was just making polite conversation, the way spouses do at work events when they're trying to find common ground. But looking back, her questions had been too specific, too focused. "Sarah seems to be working such long hours lately," Margaret had said, sipping her wine and watching me carefully. "Richard is always talking about how dedicated she is, how she stays late to help him with special projects." "She's always been a hard worker," I'd replied, not thinking much of it. "Of course. It's just that Richard has been working late so frequently. I worry about him burning out, you know? All those evening meetings and weekend consultations." At the time, I'd nodded sympathetically. Now I wondered if Margaret had been fishing for information, trying to determine how much I knew about my wife's actual whereabouts during those late nights. The GPS math didn't add up either. Sarah claimed to be at the hospital, which was a 15-minute drive from our house, but her phone's location services, which she'd forgotten I had access to through our shared family plan, showed her device pinging from cell towers near Lake Morrison, specifically around the Lakeshore Drive area, where the expensive houses sat on large wooded lots overlooking the water. Dr. Brennan's house was at 1247 Lakeshore Drive, according to the hospital directory. That was a 40-minute drive from our place, not 15. When Sarah burst through our front door that night, her appearance told a story that had nothing to do with working late at an office. Her hair was disheveled, not just messy, but deliberately tousled, like someone had been running their fingers through it. Her makeup was smeared, lipstick gone, mascara slightly smudged around her eyes. She was missing her shoes entirely, carrying them in one hand while trying to smooth down her skirt with the other. Most damning of all, she had mud on her heels and the backs of her calves. Not regular dirt or the kind of grime you'd pick up walking across a hospital parking lot, but the distinctive red clay that only came from the unpaved access roads around Lake Morrison. I knew that mud well because Emma and I had gone fishing out there countless times over the years, and we'd always come home with that same reddish clay caked on our boots. "David, I can explain," she started, but I held up my hand to stop her. The words came out calmer than I felt, clinical and detached, like I was reading a radiology report to a referring physician. "Explain what exactly? That you were working late at the office?" She nodded quickly, too quickly. "Yes, we had a massive backlog of surgical scheduling to review, and Dr. Brennan wanted to—" "Because your car's GPS history shows you've been at 1247 Lakeshore Drive for the past 3 hours, I interrupted. "That's not the hospital, Sarah. That's Dr. Brennan's home address." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound, like a fish gasping for air. "You've been tracking me?" she finally managed to whisper. "I've been trying to understand why my wife of 23 years has been lying to me systematically for the past 4 months, I replied, standing up from the kitchen table and crossing my arms. "The family phone plan includes location sharing, remember? You set it up yourself 2 years ago when Emma started college, so we could all keep track of each other for safety reasons." Sarah's shoulders sagged as if someone had cut the strings holding her upright. She looked like a patient who'd just received a terminal diagnosis, shocked, defeated, and desperately searching for words that wouldn't come. "How long?" I asked, my voice still steady despite the rage building in my chest. "David, please, let me explain." "How long, Sarah?" I repeated, each word sharp and precise. She closed her eyes, took a shuddering breath, and whispered, 6 months. The number hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. 6 months. Half a year of systematic deception. 6 months of coming home to kiss me hello while she still had another man's scent on her skin. 6 months of me being the fool who believed his wife when she said she was working late, who defended her dedication and work ethic to friends who probably already knew the truth. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my jacket from the back of the kitchen chair. "Where are you going?" Her voice was small, frightened. I paused at the door, looking back at this woman I'd shared more than half my adult life with. This person I'd trusted completely, and who had been betraying that trust for half a year. "To think," I said. "And Sarah? When I get back, you'd better have a damn good explanation for why I shouldn't call a divorce lawyer first thing in the morning." I drove aimlessly through Millbrook's quiet streets for over an hour, my mind racing through months of small details that suddenly made perfect sense. Sarah's new perfume, something expensive and sophisticated that replaced the vanilla body spray she'd worn for years. Her late-night showers, claiming she needed to wash off the hospital smell before coming to bed. The way she'd started guarding her phone like it contained state secrets, taking it with her to the bathroom and sleeping with it face down on the nightstand. There were bigger changes, too, things I'd attributed to her promotion and increased responsibilities. New clothes that were more stylish and form-fitting than her usual conservative work attire. A gym membership she'd insisted on getting, claiming she needed to stay in shape for her demanding job. Longer lunch breaks that she explained as networking opportunities with other department heads. I'd been so focused on my own work, so trusting of the woman I'd built a life with, that I'd missed every single red flag. Or maybe I'd seen them and chosen to ignore them, telling myself that suspicion was just paranoia, and that 23 years of marriage had earned Sarah the benefit of the doubt. Around midnight, I found myself parked across the street from 1247 Lakeshore Drive, Dr. Richard Brennan's lakeside house. It was a sprawling contemporary structure with floor-to-ceiling windows and a deck that extended out over the water. His black BMW was parked in the circular driveway next to Sarah's silver Honda Accord. The living room windows glowed warm and inviting, and through the sheer curtains, I could see two silhouettes moving inside, intimate, comfortable, like they belonged together. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching my marriage dissolve through someone else's windows. Part of me wanted to march up to that door, pound on it until they answered, and confront them both in the most dramatic and satisfying way possible. The rational part of my brain knew that would accomplish nothing except giving them ammunition to use against me later. Instead, I took photographs. Lots of them. The two cars in the driveway, the house number clearly visible, the timestamp on my phone showing 12:47 a.m. when Sarah was supposed to have been working late at the hospital. If this situation was heading toward divorce court, and it seemed inevitable that it was, I wanted documentation that would hold up under legal scrutiny. The drive home felt like traveling through a different world. Everything looked the same streets I'd driven for 15 years, the same houses with their perfectly manicured lawns, the same stop signs and traffic lights, but nothing felt familiar anymore. It was like discovering that the life I thought I'd been living was actually an elaborate stage set, and now I could see the scaffolding and painted backdrops that had been hidden before. Sarah was waiting for me when I got home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. She'd changed into her pajamas and washed her face, removing the last traces of her evening with Dr. Brennan. "We need to talk," she said, as I hung up my jacket. "No," I replied. "We really don't. Not tonight." "David, please. I know how this looks, but it's not what you think." I turned to face her, and for a moment, I saw a stranger wearing my wife's face. "It's not what I think. Sarah, I just drove by Brennan's house. Your car is in his driveway. You came home with mud on your legs from his property and another man's cologne on your clothes. What exactly do you think I think?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand. "Don't," I said. "Don't insult my intelligence by trying to explain this away. Don't tell me it was a work meeting that ran late or that you stopped by his house to drop off paperwork. Just don't." I headed toward the stairs, then paused. "I'll be sleeping in the guest room from now on. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "David." "Tomorrow, Sarah. I can't do this tonight." The next morning, Sarah tried to act normal. She made coffee using my favorite dark roast, asked about my schedule for the day, and kissed my cheek before leaving for work. All the little rituals that had defined our mornings for over 2 decades. The performance was almost convincing, except for the guilt written across her face in lines I'd never seen before. At the hospital, I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored or dismissed as unimportant. Dr. Brennan's schedule, his interactions with staff, the way certain nurses and technicians exchanged glances when he walked by. I also started noticing Margaret Brennan's visits to the hospital. She served on the board of directors, but her appearances had become more frequent over the past few months. During my lunch break, I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich when Margaret approached my table. She was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something different about her demeanor, a tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. "Mind if I join you, David?" she asked. "Of course not," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Margaret sat down and looked around the cafeteria, making sure we weren't being overheard. "How are you holding up?" The question was loaded with meaning, and we both knew it. "I'm sorry?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "My husband thinks he's much cleverer than he actually is, David. He's not nearly as discreet as he believes himself to be. I've known about Sarah for months." The words hit me like a slap. Here I was, thinking I'd just discovered this devastating secret, and Dr. Brennan's wife had been living with the knowledge for months. We sat in silence for a moment, two people whose spouses had thought they were fools. "What are you going to do?" I asked finally. Margaret's smile was cold and calculating. "I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago. I have photographs, credit card statements, hotel receipts, restaurant bills. I've been building a comprehensive case." "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I needed corroborating evidence from someone else, someone who could verify the timeline and behavior patterns from Sarah's end." She pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. "I was hoping you might be willing to help." Inside the folder were dozens of photographs, printed on high-quality paper with timestamps and location data clearly visible. Sarah and Dr. Brennan at expensive restaurants I'd never heard of. Sarah and Dr. Brennan walking hand in hand through downtown Millbrook's historic district. Sarah and Dr. Brennan entering and leaving various hotels in Columbus and Cleveland. The dates went back 10 months, not 6, like Sarah had admitted. "She lied about the timeline," I said, studying the earliest photographs. "They always do," Margaret replied. "The first instinct is always to minimize, to make it seem like less of a betrayal than it actually was. Richard told me it had been going on for 3 months when I confronted him. The evidence shows it's been nearly a year." I flipped through more photographs, each one a small knife twist in my chest. There was Sarah laughing at something Dr. Brennan had said, looking happier and more animated than she'd been at home in years. There was Sarah wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something expensive and elegant that she certainly hadn't bought on her hospital salary. There was Sarah kissing Dr. Brennan in the parking lot of a hotel, her arms wrapped around his neck like a teenager with her first boyfriend. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Margaret's expression was all business now. "I want to destroy them both, David. Not just end the affair, but make sure they face real consequences for what they've done. Are you interested in hearing my plan?" Margaret's plan was elegant in its complexity and devastating in its potential consequences. As a board member at Mercy General, she had access to hospital records, scheduling systems, and financial data that regular employees couldn't touch. What she'd discovered went far beyond a simple extramarital affair. "Richard has been systematically manipulating surgery schedules," she explained during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop in the next town over, where we were unlikely to run into anyone from the hospital. "He blocks out operating rooms for fake emergency surgeries, then uses the hospital's after-hours access to create alibis for his affairs." She showed me printouts of surgical schedules cross-referenced with badge swipe data from the hospital's security system. Dr. Brennan's emergency surgeries coincided perfectly with Sarah's late nights, but there were no actual patients scheduled, no surgical reports filed, no post-operative care documented, and no billing records generated. He's been using hospital resources to facilitate multiple affairs, Margaret continued, her voice steady, but her eyes blazing with controlled fury. Sarah isn't his first victim, and she probably won't be his last. I found evidence of at least 3 other relationships with hospital employees over the past 2 years. The scope of the deception was staggering. Dr. Brennan hadn't just betrayed his marriage and mine. He'd committed fraud, violated medical ethics, potentially endangered patients by falsifying surgical records, and created a pattern of predatory behavior toward hospital employees. What about the other women? I asked. 2 of them transferred to other hospitals within 6 months of their relationships with Richard ending. One quit the medical field entirely and moved to another state. All of them were afraid to report him because of his position and influence within the hospital system. Margaret pulled out another folder, this one containing financial records that painted an even more disturbing picture. He's been using hospital credit accounts to pay for hotel rooms, restaurant meals, and gifts. The accounting department processes them as legitimate business expenses: client dinners, medical conferences, continuing education seminars. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of what she was showing me. So, what's the end game here? Margaret's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We expose everything: the affairs, the financial fraud, the abuse of power, the pattern of predatory behavior toward female employees. But we do it properly, through official channels, with documentation that will hold up under the most intense scrutiny. Over the next 3 weeks, we built our case with the methodical precision of scientists conducting a critical experiment. I used my access to the radiology department to cross-reference imaging schedules with Dr. Brennan's alleged surgeries. When he claimed to be performing emergency cardiac procedures, there were no corresponding orders for preoperative imaging, no post-surgical follow-up scans, no radiological documentation of any kind. Margaret compiled financial records showing systematic misuse of hospital resources. Hotel bills charged to medical conference accounts when no conferences were taking place. Restaurant expenses categorized as client meetings when the only attendees were Dr. Brennan and whichever hospital employee he was pursuing at the time. Gifts purchased on hospital credit cards and listed as patient appreciation or staff recognition expenses. We documented every lie, every falsified record, every breach of medical ethics and hospital policy. The pattern was undeniable. Dr. Brennan had been running a systematic scheme to facilitate and cover his affairs, using his position to intimidate potential whistleblowers and manipulate hospital systems for personal gain. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret said during our final planning meeting. "The state medical board takes fraud very seriously, especially when it involves falsifying surgical records. If we present this evidence properly, Richard won't just lose his job, he'll lose his medical license permanently. He'll never practice medicine again." And Sarah? Hospital policy is very clear about relationships that create conflicts of interest, especially when they involve fraud or misuse of resources. She'll be terminated immediately, and her professional references will reflect the reason for her dismissal. Finding another job in hospital administration will be extremely difficult. I should have felt guilty about the prospect of destroying my wife's career along with her lover's, but all I felt was a cold, analytical satisfaction. Sarah had made her choice when she decided to betray our marriage and participate in Dr. Brennan's fraudulent schemes. Now she would face the logical consequences of those choices. "When do we move?" I asked. Margaret checked her calendar. "Next Tuesday. There's a regularly scheduled board meeting, and I've arranged for all the key players to be present: the hospital administrator, the chief of staff, the head of human resources, the chairman of the medical ethics committee, and a representative from our legal department." "What do you need from me?" "Just be available to provide technical support if they have questions about the radiology evidence. I'll handle the presentation." The Tuesday morning of reckoning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Ohio weather for late October. I arrived at the hospital early, positioning myself in the radiology department where I could monitor the situation without being directly involved in the board meeting. Margaret had arranged for me to listen in through the hospital's internal communication system, so I could provide immediate clarification if questions arose about the technical evidence. At exactly 9 a.m., Margaret called the emergency session to order. Through the intercom, I could hear the rustling of papers and quiet conversation as board members took their seats in the conference room 3 floors above me. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this emergency meeting," Margaret began, her voice calm and professional. "I've discovered systematic fraud and ethical violations that require immediate action from this board. The evidence I'm about to present involves Dr. Richard Brennan, Chief of Cardiac Surgery, and multiple violations of hospital policy, medical ethics, and potentially state law." The room went silent. I could picture the board members leaning forward, suddenly alert and focused. Dr. Brennan has been systematically falsifying surgical schedules, misusing hospital resources, and engaging in multiple inappropriate relationships with staff members, Margaret continued. "These relationships have been facilitated through fraud and have created a hostile work environment for female employees." Dr. Brennan's voice cut through the silence, loud and indignant. "This is outrageous. Margaret, I don't know what kind of personal vendetta you're pursuing here, but I won't sit still for these baseless accusations. I demand to know where this information is coming from, and I want legal representation present before we go any further." Margaret's response was ice-cold professional. "You're welcome to have legal representation, Richard, but that won't change the evidence. I have documentation spanning 2 years, including falsified surgical reports, misappropriated operating room time, fraudulent use of hospital credit accounts, and photographic evidence of relationships that violate both hospital policy and medical ethics." What followed was the most methodical character assassination I'd ever witnessed. Margaret presented the evidence piece by piece, building her case like a prosecutor addressing a jury. She started with the scheduling discrepancies, showing how Dr. Brennan had blocked out operating rooms for surgeries that never took place, creating alibis for evening meetings that were actually romantic encounters. Then came the financial evidence: hotel bills, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases, all charged to hospital accounts and categorized as legitimate business expenses. The amounts were staggering, over $40,000 in fraudulent charges over the past 18 months. When she presented the photographic evidence, identifying each of Dr. Brennan's affair partners by name and showing how their relationships had been facilitated through his abuse of hospital resources, I heard someone gasp audibly over the intercom. "Sarah Mitchell from Surgical Scheduling," Margaret said, and I felt my chest tighten despite knowing this moment was coming. "Jennifer Walsh from Patient Services, who transferred to Cleveland Clinic 6 months ago. Amanda Rodriguez from Nursing Administration, who left the medical field entirely after her relationship with Dr. Brennan ended. Lisa Chen from the business office, who requested a transfer to our satellite facility rather than continue working in the same building." The hospital administrator's voice cut through the chaos that was building in the room. "Dr. Brennan, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have any response to this evidence?" Dr. Brennan's reply was exactly what I'd expected: bluster, threats, and desperate attempts to deflect blame. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by my vindictive wife. She's clearly having some kind of mental breakdown and dragging innocent people into her delusions. I've dedicated 8 years of my life to building this cardiac surgery program, and I won't let personal vendettas destroy everything I've accomplished." "The evidence speaks for itself," Margaret replied calmly. "Every document I've presented can be verified through hospital records. Every photograph is time-stamped and location verified. Every financial transaction can be traced through our accounting systems." The chairman of the Medical Ethics Committee spoke next. "Dr. Brennan, you're suspended from all surgical privileges immediately, pending a full investigation. Security will escort you from the premises within the hour. All hospital access cards and keys must be surrendered." "And Sarah Mitchell?" the hospital administrator asked. "Mrs. Mitchell should report to Human Resources immediately." came the reply. Given her involvement in these activities and her access to scheduling systems that were manipulated to facilitate this fraud, her employment is terminated effective immediately. I made my way to the administrative offices, where I positioned myself with a clear view of the HR conference room through its glass walls. 20 minutes later, I watched Sarah walk down the hallway, her face pale and her steps uncertain. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what was happening to her. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. When Sarah emerged, she was carrying a cardboard box containing her personal belongings, family photos, a coffee mug Emma had given her for Mother's Day, the small potted plant she'd kept on her desk for 3 years. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands were shaking as she struggled to maintain her grip on the box. She spotted me waiting in the hallway and stopped dead in her tracks. "You did this," she said, her voice hollow and defeated. "No, Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice steady and calm. "You did this when you decided to have an affair with your boss and help him commit fraud against the hospital that employs us both. It wasn't supposed to happen this way." "How was it supposed to happen? You and Dr. Brennan were going to continue your affair indefinitely while I remained the oblivious husband? Or were you planning to leave me eventually, once you'd figured out how to maximize your financial advantage?" She couldn't meet my eyes. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did hurt me, Sarah. For 10 months, not 6, 10. You lied to me every single day. You made me feel like I was going crazy for questioning your behavior. You let me defend your work ethic and dedication to friends and colleagues who probably already knew you were having an affair. You betrayed everything we built together, and you did it systematically and deliberately." "David, please, can't we—" "Save it," I interrupted. "I've already contacted a divorce attorney. You'll be served papers by the end of the week." The fallout from Margaret's presentation was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, the state medical board had launched a formal investigation into Dr. Brennan's conduct. The hospital's malpractice insurance carrier canceled his coverage immediately upon learning of the fraud allegations, making it impossible for him to practice medicine even if he retained his license. 3 more women came forward within the first week, each with similar stories of manipulation, abuse of power, and professional retaliation when they tried to end their relationships with Dr. Brennan. The pattern was clear. He'd been using his position systematically to prey on female hospital employees, creating a hostile work environment that the hospital administration had either ignored or failed to recognize. Sarah tried calling repeatedly, but I'd blocked her number after the 3rd desperate voicemail. She sent emails that I deleted unread, rambling messages about misunderstandings and second chances that I had no interest in reviewing. She even showed up at our house one evening, standing on the front porch in the rain and begging for a chance to explain, to make things right somehow. "There's nothing to explain," I told her through the locked door. "You made your choice when you decided to betray our marriage and participate in fraud. Now live with the consequences." "David, please, I love you. I've always loved you. Richard was just a mistake, a terrible mistake that got out of hand. A 10-month mistake, Sarah. A mistake that involved systematic deception, financial fraud, and the destruction of our marriage. That's not a mistake. That's a series of deliberate choices. I'll do anything to make this right. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. We can rebuild this." "No," I said firmly. "We can't. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired. Some trust, once destroyed, can't be restored. Go home, Sarah. We have nothing more to say to each other." My daughter Emma called from Ohio State the next day, confused and upset after Sarah had contacted her with a heavily sanitized version of events. "Dad, Mom says you're divorcing her over a misunderstanding," Emma said, her voice small and uncertain. "She says you won't even talk to her, that you're being unreasonable and cruel." I took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would be one of the most difficult of my life. "Emma, your mother had an affair with her boss for 10 months. She helped him commit fraud against the hospital, using her access to scheduling systems to cover up his illegal activities. She lied to me systematically and repeatedly, and she only stopped because we caught her. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. "I'm sorry, Dad," Emma finally whispered. "I had no idea it was that serious." "Neither did I, sweetheart, neither did I." "Are you okay? I mean, really okay?" "I'm angry, and I'm hurt, and I feel like I've been living with a stranger for the past year," I admitted. "But I'm also relieved to finally know the truth." "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," she said quietly. "It does." The divorce proceedings moved with surprising speed. Sarah's adultery voided the prenuptial agreement she'd insisted on years earlier when she'd been promoted and started earning more money. Her termination from the hospital left her with limited financial resources to fight an extended legal battle, and the evidence of her affair and participation in professional misconduct made any claim for alimony impossible to sustain. Her attorney, a tired-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who clearly recognized a losing case when he saw one, tried to argue for a more equitable division of assets based on Sarah's contributions to our household over the years. My attorney responded by presenting the evidence of fraud and adultery, making it clear that Sarah's actions had directly contributed to the dissolution of the marriage and her own financial difficulties. Margaret kept me updated on Dr. Brennan's situation through our occasional coffee meetings. The medical board's investigation had expanded as more evidence surfaced, revealing a pattern of misconduct that went back to his previous position at a hospital in Cincinnati. They found similar patterns at his last job, Margaret told me during one of our conversations. Falsified records, inappropriate relationships with staff, misuse of hospital resources. He was allowed to resign quietly rather than face formal disciplinary action, which is why none of it showed up in his background check when Mercy General hired him. How many women total? At least 8 that we know of, possibly more. The medical board is interviewing former colleagues from Cincinnati, and apparently there are some very interesting stories emerging. What about his license? The board is recommending permanent revocation, Margaret said with satisfaction. Between the fraud, the pattern of predatory behavior, and the falsified surgical records, he'll never practice medicine again. The criminal investigation is still ongoing. The prosecutor is considering charges for fraud and embezzlement. Margaret had filed for divorce the same week I did, but her situation was more complex due to Dr. Brennan's significant assets. Unlike Sarah, who had mainly her salary and benefits to lose, Dr. Brennan had accumulated substantial wealth over his career: the lakeside house, investment portfolios, a boat, luxury cars, and a substantial retirement account. "My attorney is having a field day," Margaret told me, with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. "Richard tried to hide assets by transferring money to accounts under his mother's name, but we found the paper trail. The judge was not amused by his attempts at financial manipulation." "What will you do when this is all over?" "Travel, maybe. I've spent 25 years being the perfect doctor's wife, hosting dinner parties, serving on hospital committees, supporting Richard's career while putting my own ambitions on hold. It's time to figure out who Margaret Brennan is when she's not defined by her husband's profession." I understood that feeling completely. After 2 decades of marriage, I was rediscovering my independence, remembering who David Mitchell had been before Sarah became the central organizing principle of my life. 6 months after that rainy Tuesday morning when Margaret destroyed 2 careers with a manila folder full of evidence, the dust had finally settled into new patterns. Dr. Brennan's medical license was permanently revoked after a hearing where 6 women testified about his systematic abuse of power and predatory behavior. The hospital settled multiple lawsuits out of court and implemented new policies designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The criminal case moved more slowly, but the prosecutor eventually filed charges for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of public trust. Dr. Brennan's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that avoided jail time in exchange for full restitution to the hospital and a substantial fine, but the conviction meant He could never work in healthcare again in any capacity. Sarah found employment as a medical billing clerk at a small private practice across town, a significant step down from her previous administrative role, but one of the few positions available to someone who'd been terminated for ethical violations. The job paid roughly half of her previous salary, and she'd moved into a cramped apartment in one of Millbrook's less desirable neighborhoods. Our divorce was finalized on a cold Thursday morning in February, exactly 8 months after I'd discovered her affair. 23 years of marriage dissolved in less than an hour of legal proceedings, reduced to the division of assets and the signing of papers that formally ended what had once been the most important relationship in my life. Sarah looked older when I saw her in the courthouse that day, worn down by months of stress, public scrutiny, and financial hardship. Her hair had more gray than I remembered, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there a year earlier. She tried to approach me after the hearing, but I walked past her without acknowledgement. We had nothing left to say to each other. Emma came home for spring break a few weeks later, and we spent long evenings talking about trust, betrayal, and the complexity of adult relationships. She was angry with her mother but trying to maintain some kind of connection, caught between loyalty to both parents and her own sense of right and wrong. "I still can't believe Mom threw away everything you guys built together," Emma said as we sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "People make choices, sweetheart," I replied. "Sometimes those choices have consequences they didn't anticipate or didn't want to face. Do you think you'll ever forgive her?" I considered the question carefully, knowing that Emma needed an honest answer rather than platitudes. "Forgiveness isn't really about her, Emma. It's about me choosing not to carry anger and resentment for the rest of my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened, and it doesn't mean pretending the betrayal didn't occur." "So you might forgive her someday?" "Maybe. But forgiveness doesn't equal reconciliation. Some relationships, once broken in certain ways, can't be repaired. Some trust, once destroyed, can't be rebuilt." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand." Margaret and I had developed an unexpected friendship through our shared experience of betrayal and recovery. We met occasionally for coffee or dinner, two people who'd survived their spouses' systematic deceptions and emerged stronger, if more cautious, on the other side. "Any regrets about how we handled things?" she asked during one of our conversations. "About exposing them?" "None whatsoever," I replied without hesitation. They made their choices, engaged in fraud and betrayal, and faced the natural consequences of those actions. The only regret I have is not recognizing the signs sooner. "We saw what we wanted to see," Margaret said. "We trusted people who didn't deserve that trust, who were actively working to deceive us while we were trying to maintain marriages and build lives together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found out?" Margaret's laugh was bitter. "They would have continued until they got careless enough to be caught by someone else, or until Richard moved on to his next victim and discarded Sarah the way he did the others. Men like Richard don't leave their wives for their affair partners. They just keep collecting new conquests until something forces them to stop." The final chapter of this story came almost exactly 1 year after the initial confrontation, when I received a letter from the Ohio State Medical Board. Dr. Brennan had attempted to obtain a medical license in Florida, using falsified references and omitting his disciplinary history from his application. The Florida board had contacted Ohio as part of their background check, and they were requesting additional testimony about his misconduct. I spent 2 hours on the phone with a Florida investigator, providing detailed information about Dr. Brennan's systematic fraud, his pattern of predatory behavior, and the impact his actions had on the hospital, his victims, and the families he'd destroyed. It felt like closing a book that had been left open too long, providing a final period at the end of a very long and painful sentence. The investigator, a woman named Teresa Gonzalez, listened carefully as I walked through the timeline, the fabricated credentials, The pattern of inappropriate relationships with subordinates, the financial misconduct that had nearly bankrupted the surgical department. She took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that showed she understood the full scope of Brennan's deceptions. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that your testimony is crucial here," she said as our conversation wound down. Dr. Brennan's application included glowing references from people who, when we contacted them, had never heard of him. He claimed his Ohio license was in good standing and voluntarily surrendered for personal reasons. He presented himself as a victim of hospital politics and vindictive colleagues. "That sounds like him," I said. "Dr. Brennan has always been very good at rewriting history to cast himself as the protagonist." "Well, thanks to your testimony and the documentation from Ohio State, Florida won't be giving him the opportunity to victimize anyone else. His application will be denied, and we'll be flagging his file in the national database. He won't be able to practice medicine anywhere in the United States." After we hung up, I sat at my desk feeling something close to closure. Brennan had tried to reinvent himself, to escape the consequences of his actions by moving to a new state and starting over. But the past had caught up with him, as it eventually does with everyone who thinks they can outrun their own choices. Sarah made one last attempt at reconciliation, sending a handwritten letter on the first anniversary of our divorce. The envelope was addressed in her familiar handwriting, and for a moment, holding it in my hands, I felt an echo of the love I'd once felt for her. The letter was 4 pages long, filled with regrets and apologies, explanations and justifications, and a desperate plea for a second chance. She wrote about the mistakes she'd made, the pain she'd caused, the life we'd built together that she'd thrown away for something that had never been real. She talked about counseling and personal growth, about the person she was trying to become, about hoping we could find a way to rebuild what we'd lost. "David, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she wrote in her neat cursive. "I know I hurt you in ways that can never be undone. But I've spent this year in therapy, really examining who I am and why I made the choices I made. I was selfish and cruel, and I took for granted the one person who truly loved me unconditionally." She went on to describe her current life, working as a medical assistant at a small clinic in Toledo, living in a studio apartment, attending support groups for people recovering from destructive relationships. She acknowledged that her affair with Brennan had been based on manipulation and lies, that he had exploited her insecurities and vulnerabilities for his own gratification. "I'm not making excuses," the letter continued. "I made my own choices, and I own the consequences. But I want you to know that I see clearly now what I couldn't see then, that you were the best thing in my life, and I destroyed it for something that was never real to begin with." The final page was the hardest to read. "I don't expect you to take me back. I don't even expect you to forgive me. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, truly and deeply sorry, for every lie I told and every betrayal I committed. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. If I could go back and undo it all, I would in a heartbeat. Since I can't, all I can do is try to become someone worthy of the love you once gave me, even if it's too late for us. I will always love you, David. I know I lost the right to say that, but it's true nonetheless. You were my home, and I burned it down. I hope you find happiness with someone who treasures you the way I should have. With all my regret and love, Sarah." I read the letter once, carefully and completely, then fed it into the paper shredder in my home office. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some words, once spoken, can't be taken back. Some actions have consequences that last forever. The shredder's mechanical whir felt oddly satisfying, watching Sarah's careful handwriting transformed into thin strips of meaningless paper. Part of me felt cruel for not responding, for denying her even the acknowledgement of her apology. But a larger part knew that responding would only reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. Sarah's letter was about her need for absolution, her desire to be forgiven so she could move forward without guilt. It wasn't really about me at all. It was about easing her own conscience, making herself feel better about the choices she'd made, and I was done helping Sarah feel better about herself. My phone rang later that evening. Emma calling from her apartment in Chicago where she was studying for the bar exam. "Dad, did you get a letter from Mom today? How did you know about that?" "She called me yesterday, said she was going to reach out to you, asked if I thought you'd be receptive." Emma paused. "I told her I didn't think so, but she wanted to try anyway. I read it and shredded it." "Good. She doesn't get to waltz back into your life after everything she did just because she's finally feeling guilty." Emma's voice was fierce, protective. "You've moved on, Dad. You're dating someone who actually respects you. You don't need Mom's drama anymore." She was right. Over the past year, I'd started seeing a woman named Catherine, a hospital administrator I'd met at a healthcare conference. She was divorced, had 2 grown children of her own, and understood the complications of rebuilding a life after betrayal. We took things slowly, carefully, with the kind of honesty that only comes from having learned hard lessons about the cost of deception. Catherine knew my whole story: Sarah, Brennan, the public humiliation, the difficult divorce. She'd listened without judgment, offered support without pushing, and given me the space to heal at my own pace. What we had wasn't the passionate, consuming love I'd felt for Sarah in our early years. It was something steadier, more grounded, the kind of relationship built on mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. "You're right," I told Emma. "I have moved on, and I'm not interested in going backward." "Good. Because you deserve someone who sees your worth, Dad. Someone who doesn't need to lose you to figure out what they had." Emma graduated from Ohio State with honors and landed a job with a law firm in Chicago. At her graduation ceremony, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for showing me what integrity looks like, Dad. Even when it's hard, even when it costs you something important." That meant more to me than any revenge against Sarah or Dr. Brennan ever could. Standing in the bright May sunshine, watching my daughter accept her diploma, I realized that this was the real victory, not the satisfaction of seeing my enemies brought low, but the knowledge that Emma had learned from my example, that she'd seen how I'd handled betrayal with dignity rather than cruelty, how I'd sought justice rather than mere revenge, how I'd chosen to rebuild rather than remain broken. Catherine stood beside me, her hand in mine, smiling as Emma crossed the stage. Afterward, we all went to dinner. Emma, Catherine, Catherine's daughter, who was visiting from Seattle, and me. A blended family of survivors and second chances, people who'd learned that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another. Sarah had texted Emma earlier that week, asking if she could attend the graduation. Emma had politely but firmly declined, explaining that this was a day for celebrating the future, not relitigating the past. Sarah had accepted the rejection with grace, perhaps finally understanding that some consequences last longer than regret. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation from Sarah. She was marrying a man named Robert Chen, a pharmacist she'd met at her clinic. The invitation was simple, elegant, with a handwritten note tucked inside. "David, I don't expect you to attend, but I wanted you to know that I found someone who makes me want to be better. Thank you for showing me what a good man looks like, even if I couldn't appreciate it when it mattered. I wish you every happiness. S." I sent a card with a brief congratulations and a small gift from the registry. Not because I'd forgiven her, not because I wanted to rebuild a friendship, but because holding on to anger had stopped serving me months ago. Sarah's happiness, or lack thereof, no longer affected my life. She'd become what she should have been all along, someone I used to know, someone who belonged to my past rather than my present. Catherine and I got engaged that fall, a quiet proposal over dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date. No drama, no grand gestures, just two people who'd found each other after learning the hard way what really mattered in a partnership. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, looking at the simple diamond ring I'd chosen. "I come with complications, an ex-husband, grown children, trust issues, and a very demanding job." "I'm sure," I said. "Because you're honest about your complications. Because you don't pretend to be perfect or expect me to be. Because when you say something, I can trust that you mean it." "That's a pretty low bar for marriage," she said, smiling. "You'd be surprised how rare it actually is." We married 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family. Emma stood as my best person, giving a toast that made me cry. "My father taught me that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest when you fail and courageous when you succeed. He showed me that revenge is empty, but justice is necessary. That forgiveness doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past." She raised her glass. "To David and Catherine, may your second chances be everything your first chances should have been." As I danced with my new wife, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror behind the band. 1.5 years ago, that reflection had shown a broken man, someone who'd lost his identity along with his marriage. Now I saw someone different, scarred but whole, cautious but hopeful, older and infinitely wiser about the nature of love and trust. Dr. Brennan's final attempt to practice medicine ended when the Florida Medical Board's denial triggered a cascade of investigations in other states where he'd applied. His name appeared on a national database of physicians barred from practice, ensuring he'd never work in healthcare again. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Nevada, divorced from his second wife, estranged from his children. Sarah sent a Christmas card every year, pictures of her and Robert, updates on their life together, always with a brief note wishing me well. I appreciated the gesture even if I didn't respond. She'd found her happy ending, or at least a peaceful middle chapter. That was enough. As for me, I discovered that healing wasn't a destination, but a process. One that required choosing forward motion over backward glances, choosing honesty over comfortable lies, choosing the messy reality of imperfect love over the fantasy of perfect romance. The story that had begun with betrayal and ended with divorce had taught me something crucial: that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference, and that sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies, but simply becoming someone they can no longer hurt. Standing in my new home with my new wife, building a life based on transparency rather than illusion, I realized I'd finally achieved what Sarah's letter had asked for. I'd moved on. Not because I'd forgiven her, though time had softened the sharp edges of anger. Not because I'd forgotten what happened, though the pain had faded to a manageable ache, but because I'd built something better, something real, something that belonged entirely to me, and that, in the end, was the only revenge worth having. 2 years after the divorce, I was promoted to senior radiology technician and began teaching part-time at Millbrook Community College's medical imaging program. Margaret had started a consulting business, helping hospitals improve their ethics policies and oversight procedures to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that her husband had perpetrated. We'd both found ways to turn our painful experiences into something constructive and meaningful. I never saw Sarah again after the divorce proceedings, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd eventually moved to Indianapolis and was working for a medical billing company there. Dr. Brennan had disappeared entirely from our community's radar, presumably trying to start over somewhere else under whatever professional limitations his criminal record and revoked license imposed. The house felt different without Sarah's presence. Quieter, certainly, but also more peaceful. I'd spent months redecorating, removing photographs and mementos that reminded me of our marriage, replacing them with images of Emma, my work, and the new life I was building as a single man in his 50s. One evening in late spring, while I was reviewing student papers in my home office, I received a text from an unknown number. "David, this is Sarah. I know you probably won't read this, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I hope you found happiness." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. There was sadness for what we'd lost, anger for what she'd done, and something that might have been pity for the woman who'd destroyed her own life pursuing something that had never been real. After several minutes, I deleted the message without responding. Sarah was part of my past now, a chapter that had ended definitively 2 years earlier. I had no interest in reopening that book, no desire to relitigate old grievances or explore possibilities for reconciliation that didn't actually exist. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same analytical skills that made me good at my job, the pattern recognition abilities that helped me spot abnormalities in medical images, had ultimately saved me from years of continued deception and betrayal. By paying attention to the details, by refusing to ignore the inconsistencies in Sarah's behavior, I'd uncovered the truth and taken control of a situation that could have continued indefinitely. Margaret was right when she said we'd seen what we wanted to see for too long, but once we'd opened our eyes, once we'd started looking at the evidence objectively and analytically, the truth had become undeniable. The only question then was what to do with that truth, how to respond to the systematic betrayal we'd discovered. We'd chosen to fight back, to refuse the role of victim, to ensure that our spouses faced real consequences for their actions. Some people might call that revenge, but I preferred to think of it as justice, the natural result of choices and actions, cause and effect played out to their logical conclusion. Sarah and Dr. Brennan had underestimated the people they were betraying, assuming they could manipulate and deceive us indefinitely. They'd thought we were fools who would never discover their affair, never question their lies, never fight back when we learned the truth. They were wrong on all counts. In the end, justice wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about truth, accountability, and the natural consequences of unethical behavior. Sarah and Dr. Brennan had destroyed their own lives through their choices and actions. Margaret and I had simply made sure those choices were exposed to the light, that the truth was revealed, and that appropriate consequences followed. As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace with my decisions and my life. I'd handled the situation with integrity, protected myself and others from further harm, and built a new life based on honesty, self-respect, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal. Sarah had texted that she hoped I'd found happiness. The truth was, I'd found something more valuable and lasting than happiness. I'd found myself again, the person I'd been before I'd defined myself primarily as someone's husband. I'd rediscovered my independence, my strength, and my ability to build a meaningful life on my own terms. The David Mitchell who'd received that first lying text message 2 years earlier had been trusting to a fault, willing to give his wife the benefit of the doubt even when the evidence suggested he shouldn't. The David Mitchell who deleted Sarah's apology text without responding was wiser, more cautious, but also more confident in his own judgment and more committed to living authentically. I'd entered this situation as a victim of betrayal and emerged as someone who refused to remain victimized. That transformation hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been necessary and ultimately liberating. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to 2 years earlier. Then, I'd been living a lie without knowing it, trusting someone who was systematically deceiving me, building my life around a relationship that was fundamentally dishonest. Now, every relationship in my life was authentic and honest. My friendship with Margaret was based on shared experience and mutual respect. My relationship with Emma was stronger than ever, built on trust and open communication. My work relationships were professional and straightforward, free from the complications that had destroyed my marriage. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to pay attention to patterns and inconsistencies, to value honesty above comfort or convenience. Most importantly, I'd learned that I could survive betrayal and emerge stronger on the other side. Sarah and Dr. Brennan had given me an unexpected gift, though I doubted they'd see it that way. By betraying me so completely, by forcing me to confront the truth about our marriage and fight for my own dignity, they'd helped me become a better version of myself. I wouldn't thank them for it, but I wouldn't trade the person I'd become for the naive, trusting man I'd been before I discovered their affair. That man had been